I like to sometimes start off with an observation, and a lot of times those observations are of children, as I have raised four. And I've noticed that they learn the physical mechanics of leverage sometimes long before they can define it or understand it. And depending on where you've lived, there's a device on a playground regionally known either as a seesaw or a teeter-totter. And those of us who were extremely small as children were always the ultimate losers, which means that the heavier kid in school kind of just sat there and you went up, and you didn't think about this before you got on it. Of course, it looked all fair and even until you got up there and you're just sitting up there floating in space. And every once in a while he would remove his weight from the thing and you'd come crashing down and your spine would go up into your brain. And the only thing you could do to try to even up the score if you were close in weight, which I seldom was close in weight, would be to maybe scoot out a little bit further on the seat. You didn't know what you were doing. You're just scooting back on the seat. Sometimes you would lean out, and you'd notice it kind of even out a little bit, right? Going out further to try to gain leverage. And I think one of the things I've noticed is that in society we're leaning out and trying to distance ourselves, thinking that we are gaining leverage over one another. My name is Andrew Green. This is the Idea Collision. We throw all sorts of stuff together. We try to come out with something productive, as I always say. And sometimes we're observing seemingly unconnected human truths to come out with something ultimately spiritual, make spiritual observations. Because our world is not something spiritual and simultaneously just randomly over here, something physical. All the things that we are connected. All the parts of us are connected. That it means the physical, that means the mental, that means like intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. Those things are all connected. We've been talking about American greatness or American exceptionalism, whatever you want, and looking at the two sides of that. And as we look at those, there's two sides that are always trying to gain primacy over each other. There's two opinions of things. There's one that doesn't think we're that great, and one thinks that we're great. And over time, what's happened is, like we talked about, this utopia that we create, or dystopia. There's one group that thinks that it's only evil all the time, and one thing that just thinks that everything that's ever happened, at least in their view, is perfect. And so neither of these are likely true, but over time we've got these we've moved out, and we continue to try to move out to gain leverage to prove our point over someone we see as incorrect. Now, obviously, when there's a disagreement, one side has to be more correct than another, right? It's very unlikely to be 50-50. Unless you're absolutely both completely wrong and there's a third option. But typically one leans more correct. That's just the nature of disagreements. But because of this leverage that we try to gain, we can only accept now that I'm only correct and that there's no other perspectives other than my perspective. So, what happens is that in going out and looking at this, this leverage that we gain, going out on the seesaw, as it were, we will eventually distort the truth. Even those who are kind of more on the side of truth will also be guilty of distorting the truth somewhat. And so the view is of the whatever topic it is inaccurate. This works for any topic. And so even this is so it's distorted. Even if the core concept is more or less true, we still are presenting a deceptive view of the facts. And as we say, one view tends towards hypercriticism when we're talking about American exceptionalism, and one toward over romanticizes the view of America, and we both create this um, filtered, distilled version of events, and neither one is right. I want to give you some examples of this. You might have heard of the 1619 Project. The 1619. What is the 1619 Project? Well, it centers on the topic of racism. This is not going to be a racism a podcast, but it serves as an illustration of both sides presenting something that, like, it's not accurate, right? So, so the 1619 Project says that really America started in 1619. Now, right off the top, you go, that sounds strange. Okay, why would you say that? Why pick 1619? Well, they say, well, that's when slavery came over. That's when the first slave ships came over. That's true, right? They were Dutch slave ships came over bringing slaves. But you say, in reality, the first, it technically wasn't the first, because there was nothing in Roanoke that everyone got wiped out. We don't know where they went, and we came back and there was no colony. So let's forget that colony. So 1607 is the first one down in Virginia, right? Jamestown, Virginia. And so that was in 1607. So the slave ships didn't come until 12 years later. So why do we say 1619 instead of 1607? Well, because 1607 doesn't fit the narrative. What's the narrative, right? Those who want to focus on how bad America is because of its racism, and there was incredible racism, they're going, and they're in the process of going out on the limb and saying America. You'll hear this phrase, America, is founded on racism. Well, it wasn't founded on racism. We didn't have any slaves. We didn't have any black people here at all that I know of for the first 12 years. So its original founding is not on racism, but that doesn't fit a narrative. They need a narrative that America is completely evil from the very, very beginning. So they say, well, the first 12 years doesn't count. Why doesn't it count? Because there's no slaves. Well, so there's no slaves, so that's not America. And so it's really all a big circular reasoning argument that essentially says something like America began in 1619. Why? Because the slaves. Why do you pick 1619? Well, because that's when they're slaves. So we're running it around and around and around in a circle, but not ever proving the point that America started in 1619. Alternately, you can hear people will try to diminish this at the same time. So they'll try to soft pedal the acts of slavery that are going on, and there were Irish slaves. Okay, that's also true, but there were more indentured servants, and they were probably treated a little bit better, even though they weren't treated nicely. They were probably treated better than the African slaves, because the opinions of British people at the time, we were British, were pretty clear about what we thought at the time about people that weren't white. I mean, those opinions are written. They're there to read. And not just like African people. I mean, we thought the same thing as of the Hindus and the Mohammedans, and like we thought that those were all varying degrees of inferior people. So we can see both sides trying to shade things towards their view of the world. And it goes out. Let's talk about another thing. So we end up with this mythology. Is what happens. We end up with a mythology of America that neither one is presenting something that's really true. Another one that gets repeated, and I grew up with this. We were willing to say this in schools back when I was a kid still, is that America was a Christian nation, or is a Christian nation. Now, it certainly isn't now, but even if the majority of people kind of identify as Christian, like if you look at church attendance or like what people think, like it clearly is not a primarily Christian nation. But what about its founding? Well, there's two sides. One side is like an atheist side that wants there to be no connection whatsoever to God at our founding and wants to try to find that and goes in search of that outcome. The other wants us to be like this totally, like what you would imagine of a Christian that was like everybody in our country. And neither one is true. So let's kind of, and so we try to gain leverage. And the way we gain leverage, we do a couple of things. Primarily, how are we going to do that? We're going to look at the quotes of things. We're going to look at what people said. And we're going to talk about how we do that, because how we do that tends to be a little dishonest on both sides. So clearly, first of all, let's begin with this. Clearly, Christianity is a part of the fabric of the United States of America. Why? Well, we came from nations that were Christian in their fabric. We also have, what was the option? So these are your options if you're not Christian. You could be Muslim. That wasn't a thing in Europe at the time. You could be Hindu. That wasn't a thing in Europe at the time. You couldn't be what we would then alternately choose. I don't believe in God. That didn't exist at the time. Atheism didn't exist at the time. I'm not saying that there's no person that didn't believe in God, but I'm saying it wasn't considered a religious option at the time. Atheism doesn't come along until about the French Revolution. Like even prior to the French Revolution, men like Voltaire, they were at the most what we would call agnostic. But that's 150, 60 years after America's founding, right? America's founded in the early 1600s. French Revolution isn't until almost the 1800s, right? So agnosticism and atheism don't even exist yet as an option. So the only alternative is some form of Christianity, loosely, whatever we're going to call it. So obviously, Christianity is a part of our founding in the 1600s. We can't get away from that. If you go back and read their journals, like clearly. Now, there's a mixed bag of mythology, however, that gets wrapped up in this, and it's all in the massaging of facts, right? So, there's another religion that we're going to talk about, and that's one called deism. But again, deism didn't exist in the 1600s. It grows kind of out of this agnosticism. It's a part of this process of what's happening in Europe in the 1700s, not in the 1600s. So we clearly were Christian in our core. But even within that, if we accept that, there's still a romanticization of America, because you'll hear this phrase. You'll hear that we came here for religious freedom. That's not really true. What we came here for was, one of it has to do with, money was clearly a part of it. But in the early people who came over, a lot of their motivation, maybe not every one of them, but a lot of their motivation was they were, yes, people who were looking to be financially free, but they were also people who were, let's say you were in England and your family had secretly been Catholic, but you were being persecuted because that's the Anglican Church. Or you might be coming from, a different place where Catholicism was persecuting the Protestant Church, because in the 1600s people were still getting burned at the stake for their faith. We don't know that. Like we think, oh, America's founded, we're all modern. No, people were still being murdered for their religion. And so there was people that were wanting to be free from that. When they got here, they didn't go, you know what? We didn't like how we were treated. We're going to create freedom. What they did is, we're going to create a place where now Catholics can be free to practice Catholicism, or this Protestant, we're going to be Puritan here. If you weren't Puritan in Massachusetts, you got kicked out. There was no religious freedom. So America's begins in 1607. The first actual free state is Rhode Island. Right? So a guy by the name of Roger Williams was kicked out of Massachusetts for wanting to, fortunately they didn't kill him, but he was banished from his state because he didn't want to be Puritan. So he founded Rhode Island. He founded Rhode Island in 1663. That's 56 years after America starts. It took 56 years for the first state to actually have what we would call religious freedom. See, there's a mythology there. So there's this mythology that we have. And so another myth, we mentioned it already, but surrounds the idea of deism, right? And so a lot of people who are atheists know that they can't say and claim that our founding fathers were atheists. There's just simply too many quotes. The one guy that they'll try to slip in is Thomas Paine, and I'm not going to go into all these quotes, but Thomas Paine was clearly, from his quotations, did not believe in no existence of God. It's clear. You can't read them. However, in quoting people, there's some problems with quoting people. So let me just stop right there. So the two views of atheists is some try to go way so far. They go so far out and try to claim that we were atheists that they've done fall off the seesaw. You can't help that. But most of them will say, okay, they were deists, which is, so deism was just this idea that God kind of started it, like we'll call him the creator. That sounds familiar. And we'll acknowledge that God, there's a divine power out there that made everything, but he kind of runs off and lets us do our own thing. Every once in a while he'll check in and like, did you burn the place down? No, okay, good. Keep on doing what you're doing. That's deism. And there are clearly those in our history that are in our American history that were influenced by France, where a lot of this idea starts, and a lot of it has to do with the gross, disgusting, immoral practices of France and Europe in general, right? As these thoughts are developing, and that's attractive to people, and it allows them to justify bad behavior, right? It allows Americans to feel religious while justifying slavery, for example, because intrinsically, I think when you're doing that is bad. So you have to try to separate God from yourself. But if you've been raised with Christianity, it's hard to go, you know what, I'm just gonna. If you've been raised with anything, it's hard to just go, I don't believe that anymore. Those connections are a part of your personal makeup. So there were a lot of people that wanted to maintain their identity as Christian, but still wanted to own slaves or still wanted to, do whatever things that they wanted to do. Benjamin Franklin was a deist. Thomas Paine was a deist, right? He wasn't an atheist. There's others that were. And so, but a lot of the people, it's like, were they a deist or not a deist? It's hard to know, because what we have access to is their quotes. And here's a problem with quotes. First of all, when you quote a person, it's hard to, just because they're things on paper, it's hard to know the context. And like, are you quoting something from their youth, as opposed to another person will say, oh, here's this quote. So we go back and forth with the quote war. And one person can be quoting from one part of the life, and one person can be quoting from another, and those can be accurate representations of that person at different times in his life. Was he a person that was like a skeptic that grew up and kind of like, I was probably wrong on that? Or is he a person that like was really, really religious, but over time got more jaded with it's hard to know that. So the other thing that we do with quotations is that we selectively quote not just from one point of a life to another point of the life, but we'll just randomly chop an individual quote up to make it sound like it's saying something, right? This is a part of that leaning back and gaining leverage. I'm gonna selectively quote and cherry pick this phrase out of the quote and present it as the entirety, as though it stands alone, when it doesn't. I want to give you, and there's a great person that proves some of this, because both sides quote this guy. His name is Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson talked about a lot of things. One of the things Thomas Jefferson that is because he was an integral part of our founding documents, along with Madison and others. But he talked about how like they used the word creator, and he said, at the beginning, right? And this is just in his separate writings. He said when we were talking about these, there was a lot of discussion about putting Jesus in. Well, when he says that, that means that a lot of the people were what you and I would consider Christians. That they wanted references to Jesus. But he said, listen, if we do that, we're not going to have the country we want. We want a country where Hindu people and Mohammedans, as they called them at the time, and even deists, where they can have an access to this country and to the great things of this country. So they made it more general, and they deliberately kind of watered down the references to Christianity. So to sit here and say that it's a integral Christian nation, there's people who, and I respect a lot of what they stand for. People like Charlie Kirk will go around and I've heard this basic, this basic storyline, that going around and looking at all the quotes of people and trying to find Christianity in our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence. There is theism in it, but there's not Christianity in it, and maybe that's good. But let me give you some quotes that are presented from Thomas Jefferson, and depending on what your side is, you've either heard these, or if you care about the quotes, maybe you've never really engaged. But so I'm going to kind of read a partial quote, and if you've engaged or listened to this discussion to any significance, you've probably heard a quote like this. But I'm going to give you the quote that one side likes, and then I'm going to give you the full quote, and you're going to see how it's like, oh, wait a minute, he wasn't really saying, they just chopped that up to make it sound like something. So atheists like this quote, or critics, skeptics, whatever you want to call them. They say, question with boldness even the existence of a God. Well, that sounds like, if you stop right there, that sounds like Thomas Jefferson saying, you shouldn't really believe in a God. You should question that. That's a good thing to do. Question that, because, there's no God. That sounds like what Thomas Jefferson is saying, doesn't it? Now let's read the whole quote. He says, question with boldness even the existence of a God, because if there is one, he must even more approve the homage of reason than that of blindfolded fear. In other words, he says God is not really afraid of being questioned. I mean, if God is who God is, then he's got to be a God that likes people pursuing intelligence. And so, it's kind of like Jesus wasn't opposed. I mean, he did kind of criticize Thomas in the upper room for needing evidence, but at the same time, he supplied him with the evidence. He wasn't against it, like Jesus wasn't intimidated because you're questioning me. So atheists like the first part; they don't like the second part because it presents in context Thomas Jefferson's view on things. In other words, he believed in God. Thomas Jefferson said this: "I am a Christian." He did. Christians love that quote, and sometimes you'll hear it presented there. It's a much longer quote. Let me give you the full quote. I might have to explain it. Jefferson said this: "I am a Christian in the only sense in which he ever wished anyone to be. That is, being sincerely attached to his doctrines in preference to all others." Sounds good so far. "And ascribing to himself every human excellence and believing that he never claimed any other." Wait a minute. What? That was a long phrase. So let me unpack it for you. He says, "I'm a Christian in the only sense that he wished anyone to be." So in other words, I'm a Christian, and this is all that Jesus ever wanted, is a Christian like this, to be attached to his teachings, okay, or doctrines, over all other possible teachings. In other words, to believe that Jesus' teachings were better than Buddhist teachings, Hindu teachings, Muslim teachings. Okay, so I'm with him so far. Thomas Jefferson, great. And he ascribed, and me, Thomas Jefferson, ascribing to him every human excellence. He was just a great human being, but believing that he never claimed any other excellence. In other words, he never claimed to be divine. That's what a Christian is. To Thomas Jefferson, a Christian is a genuine Christian is someone that does not believe that Jesus was divine. In fact, and so obviously that part has to be cut out. So sometimes the quote will have more than just "I'm a Christian," sincerely attached to his doctrines in preference to all others, and they'll stop it there because that sounds Christian, to believe that Jesus' teachings are better than anyone else's. I believe that. And they won't go into the part where Thomas Jefferson did not believe in the Trinity, did not believe in Jesus' deity. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson had his own Bible. It's called the Jeffersonian Bible, and he went through, and what he just did was arbitrarily took out any miracles that Jesus performed and any claims where it could be perceived that Jesus was claiming deity. He just chopped them out. That doesn't sound that very Christian of him. Right? So was he a deist? I mean, he made too many quotes about things to be considered a deist. Was he a Christian? I came across this. It was I can't remember what college it was. It may be Columbia, but a professor of some sort of theology, and said there's an option that a lot of people don't understand. That there was a version of Christianity that wasn't typical Christianity, but it also wasn't deism, and it was called theistic rationalism, where you liked the teachings and the doctrines, but you didn't like all the supernatural stuff. And a lot of that had to do with connections to religions that they didn't like. They didn't like to go to church all the time. They would be considered members. They'd be on the rolls because, it's hard. It was hard at the time to be political and successful political if you didn't have you weren't a member of a church, which kind of underscores the fact that we were a Christian nation to some degree, or to a significant degree. But so our founding has these traces of Christianity, but it's not enough, I don't think, to say that we are a purely Christian nation in our founding, referring to 1776. I'm not talking about 1607. I'm talking about from the beginning of when we are our own nation free from England. That our Constitution and our Declaration are not there to enforce Christianity. And I think that's the way that as we go out on this limb that people want to present it, right? And so trying to support our ideology, we try to gain leverage, and it's not really productive. It doesn't, because we end up presenting this distorted view. Certainly, Christian ideals, wouldn't it be just better to say, you know, a lot of Christian ideals were a part of our fabric as a beginning, as a nation, as a people here? That would be more accurate, and we could leave it there and we could be accurate. Or wouldn't it be enough for people who look at things from the other perspective to say, you know, slavery was a part of our fabric from very early, at least in many parts, not even in all parts of our country, but in many parts of our country, slavery was a part of our early fabric, and we have to acknowledge that. That would be accurate. No one could debate it. And what it would do is get us off the ledge and bring us closer where we can have some conversations without feeling like, you know, one side or the other is completely wrong. Then we can have accurate and open discussions about anything, and this works on any topic. I've just selected some that have to do with our American mythology, but this can do with any difference of opinion that you might have within a church, or even a secular conversation you're having. If we don't go so far out on the edge to try to present our view as the only correct view, and I'm 100% right, we need to be willing to explore thoughts that we're not used to, that are inconvenient, and it creates a grounds for communications, and it invites people into the middle where we don't isolate them off, and we don't drive people away. My name is Andrew Green. This is the Idea Collision, and I hope you join me next time.